On August 3rd, 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II received a telegraph from his cousin King George V, and within 24 hours, Britain and Germany were at war. Two men, both grandsons of Queen Victoria, both carrying the same bloodline, now leading opposing empires into the most destructive conflict the world had yet seen. 3 years into that war, one of those cousins would erase his family name from history. Not reduce it, not modify it. Erase it entirely and replace it with something that sounded ancient and English and safe. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha became the House of Windsor on July 17, 1917, and the world accepted it without a second question. But here is what the official chambers of history will not tell you. The name change in 1917 was not a wartime public relations decision. It was the latest step in a process of identity reconstruction that this bloodline has been performing for centuries. And when you follow the lineage backward past the German principalities, past the Wettin dynasty, past the fragmentary medieval records that survive only because someone chose to preserve them, you arrive at something the royal historiographers have spent generations trying to keep buried. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching from. I want to see every country represented in those comments. And if you are new here, subscribe, because what we follow here every week is the thread that the official story does not want you to pull. Let us start with what the establishment wants you to believe, because it is important to understand the official version precisely before we examine what it is concealing. In 1917, Britain was 3 years into a war with Germany. Anti-German sentiment had reached a pitch of mass public hysteria. German-owned shops were being vandalized. Streets with German-sounding names were being renamed. German shepherd dogs were being renamed Alsatians. Into this atmosphere sat the royal family, whose patriarch was the first cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm II, whose family name was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, two places located firmly inside the German Empire they were supposedly fighting against. Prime Minister David Lloyd George made clear to the king that something had to change. A British monarch with a German dynastic name leading a war against Germany was the kind of visible contradiction that could destabilize the monarchy entirely. George V made his choice. He chose Windsor, the name of the castle in Berkshire that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. It sounded ancient, it sounded English, it sounded completely safe. Kaiser Wilhelm II, when he heard the news, reportedly mocked his cousin. He said he was looking forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. But the joke did not land the way Wilhelm intended, because the British public accepted the new name without resistance. Windsor stuck. Within a generation, most people had forgotten there was ever anything else. That is the official story. Neat, logical, wartime necessity. A family protecting itself from public anger by choosing a more appropriate name. Now let us pull a different thread entirely. The family name before Windsor was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The dynasty before that was the Wettin family. The Wettins had ruled across German-speaking lands for nearly 1,000 years, with their documented lineage traced back to the 10th century in what is now the region of Saxony. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840, the Wettin bloodline entered the British royal succession. Her son, Edward VII, became the first British monarch of the Wettin line. His grandson, George V, renamed them all Windsor. The Wettin roots are extensively documented, but the Wettin documentation does not go back forever. it stops. And what the Tartarian researchers have been asking with increasing urgency is what existed before the documentation begins. Because if you follow the migration patterns of the ruling families of medieval Saxony and map them against what Tartarian researchers identify as the Old World Empire, a fundamentally different picture begins to emerge. For several centuries on official European maps, there was a territory labelled Tartaria. It stretched across a vast portion of Eurasia, covering what we now call Russia, Central Asia, and large portions of Eastern Europe. On maps produced by Dutch cartographers in the 17th century, on French maps, on British maps, Tartaria was labelled as a real and present place, an empire so vast it dwarfed every European nation of the time. You can look at these maps yourself today. They are not hidden. They sit in the collections of universities and national archives accessible to anyone. What is not provided is an adequate explanation for what they actually show. The mainstream position holds that Tartaria was a loose geographic label applied by European mapmakers to the lands of various Mongol and Turkic peoples following the Mongol conquests. Over time, as European knowledge of Central Asia improved, the label was phased out. By the 19th century, Tartaria as a map designation had disappeared entirely, a cartographic convention, nothing more. That is the official position. The Tartarian researchers reject that explanation as profoundly incomplete. They point to the scale, the infrastructure, the architectural sophistication documented in regions the old maps labelled as Tartarian. What appears on those maps does not match a loose confederation of nomadic tribes. Tartaria, as documented in sources prior to the 19th century, appears to have been a functioning, organized, possibly highly advanced civilization. And then it vanished. Not gradually, not through slow historical decline. It vanished from the record at a specific historical moment, replaced by the world we now recognize as modern history. The mud flood theory sits at the center of this research. It holds that a catastrophic event, possibly in the late 18th or early 19th century, buried much of the Old World civilization beneath a layer of deposited sediment. Buildings across Europe and Asia show lower floors filled with earth. Windows that begin below what is now the soil line. Doorways descending rather than ascending from the current street level. Official history explains this as gradual accumulation over centuries of normal human activity. The Tartarian researchers point to the uniformity of the burial pattern. The same phenomenon appears across continents, in cities supposedly founded at completely different times by completely different peoples. And they ask why the burial appears to stop at roughly the same historical moment everywhere you look. The reset narrative follows directly from this. If there was a global, catastrophic event that buried the previous civilization, and if the current ruling dynasties emerged in its aftermath, then the question of who the ruling families actually are becomes not a matter of historical curiosity, but a matter of fundamental importance. The survivors who moved fastest to control the new historical narrative would have had the power to write any origin story they chose. And they would have had every reason to write one that obscured what came before. This is where the family now called Windsor re-enters the picture with new urgency. The Wettin family rose to documented prominence in Saxony in the 10th century, but 10th century documentation is fragmentary. controlled by church scriptoriums and frequently revised. What we know about this period is what the survivors of whatever preceded the medieval world chose to preserve and what they chose to edit. And what the Tartarian researchers have been assembling is a case that the ruling families of medieval Europe were not native to the European landscape in the way mainstream history presents, that they were the administrative class of the old Tartarian Empire, the people who had operated the systems of the previous civilization and who re-emerged after the catastrophe to establish control over the surviving population with institutional knowledge that population no longer possessed. The bloodline continuity theory holds that certain family lines maintained coherence across the reset, that they preserved deliberately the organizational knowledge of what had existed before, that their power derived not from slow feudal accumulation, but from inherited access to systems, to architectural knowledge, to administrative frameworks that the general population had lost entirely in the catastrophe and could not reconstruct without guidance. The great royal houses of Europe in this framework are not the products of medieval history building slowly and organically upward. They are the remnants of a much older system wearing new names, operating according to patterns of governance that stretch back before the historical memory of any surviving civilization. And the names are where the traces become most visible. Consider the naming convention directly. Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, these are place names, not family names in the traditional sense. The dynasty named itself for its territories the way an administrative body names itself for the system it operates, not the way a blood family names itself for its ancestors. It is a bureaucratic naming convention, and when you look at the territories these families controlled, you see a pattern of acquisition that looks less like feudal expansion and more like the systematic reclamation of infrastructure that someone already knew the value of. The fortified positions, the river crossings, the high ground overlooking trade routes. The placement of their holdings follows a logic that presupposes knowledge of why those specific locations mattered within a larger system. Knowledge you would only possess if you had operated that system before in a previous arrangement that the current historical record refuses to acknowledge. Here is why the official wartime explanation, while plausible on its surface, breaks down under examination. Royal houses across European history treated their family names as among the most sacrosanct symbols of their legitimacy. The name was the visible proof of the bloodline's continuity. To abandon it was to break the chain in a way that no traditional European dynasty would consider lightly. The Habsburgs kept their name through 2 world wars, through revolutions, through the complete collapse of their empire. The Romanovs were executed with their name intact rather than change it. Across centuries of European royal history, dynasties endured almost any external pressure rather than sever their nominal connection to their lineage. For a royal house to voluntarily erase its name required not merely political pressure, but something far more fundamental threatening the continuation of its identity. Unless the name itself was already the problem. Not because it was German during a war with Germany, though that was the convenient available justification, but because someone within the inner circle understood what that name actually pointed toward, and where a sufficiently determined researcher following it backward might eventually arrive. The official story says the 1917 name change was about managing public perception in a moment of political vulnerability. The alternative reading says it was about severing a paper trail. And the question that follows from that reading is what was at the end of that trail, who understood its significance, and who made the decision more than a century ago that it needed to be permanently cut. The old maps still exist. They sit in libraries and national archives and can be examined today by anyone who chooses to look. The buildings with their buried lower floors and below-grade windows still stand across Europe and can be visited. The genealogical records still stop abruptly at the edge of the medieval period, precisely where the questions become most consequential. And the family now called Windsor still sits on the British throne, carrying a name chosen in 1917 from a castle in Berkshire because the name they carried before was becoming too much of a liability. Whatever that liability was, it was not simply the embarrassment of sharing a dynastic name with a wartime enemy. That kind of embarrassment does not make a royal house erase 1,000 years of nominal continuity. It was something older and something that pointed somewhere the keepers of the official narrative had decided the public should not be permitted to follow. The Tartarian research community continues to press toward that something. One buried document and one unanswered genealogical question at a time. The traces are there for anyone willing to examine them without the institutional framework already loaded in their thinking. Drop a comment right now and tell me what you think the 1917 name change was actually hiding. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what thread you want us to follow next. The conversation is already happening down there, and it is a conversation that the official history of the British monarchy has never been seriously required to join. The House of Windsor was created in a single afternoon in July 1917. What it replaced had existed for 1,000 years of documented history and for something considerably longer before the documentation begins. The name is gone. The trail it pointed toward is still there. And the question of where it leads is still waiting for an answer that the official record has not provided.